Good morning. Welcome to today's daily devotional. Thank you for choosing to be a part of this devotional today. We are nearing the end of the study of the Gospel of Matthew. Our devotional time and our meditation time in the Gospel of Matthew are learning about Jesus in a very profound and significant way. As we have studied through the Gospel of Matthew, we have finally reached the point of the suffering of Jesus. The crucifixion of Jesus is where we are at in the Gospel of Matthew. Today we're going to look at Matthew chapter 27, and we're only going to look at 9 verses today. We're going to look at verses 26 through 35, and we'll pick up the rest of the story of the crucifixion tomorrow in our devotional for tomorrow. If you remember where we have come from, Jesus had been celebrating the Passover with his disciples. They had celebrated the Passover there in the upper room. They had shared in that special, symbolic Passover meal. Every Passover meal is very symbolic of Jesus. He is woven throughout the entire story, as the Jews have been celebrating for centuries and centuries before Jesus was even around. He celebrated that Passover meal with his disciples. He went out into the Garden of Gethsemane. It would have been the middle of the night. He was taken and arrested. He was betrayed there in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was taken and had two religious trials. One was a false trial. Both of them were very false trials. They were illegal trials. The second one was at least in the daylight hours, which was at least made it somewhat legal, but they had already decided that they wanted Jesus to die even before they presented any kind of evidence. They just had to come up with trumped up charges to be able to bring those and levy those against Jesus. Jesus was then taken before Pilate. Pilate was greatly impressed by Jesus. He was warned by his wife about Jesus having nothing to do with him, and yet Pilate gave the opportunity for Jesus to be released, but he backed down and he listened to the call of the crowd, which they requested Barabbas to be released, a notorious prisoner, a murderer, somebody who was really wicked in their sights. They asked for Barabbas to be released instead of Jesus. Pilate, sitting on the judgment seat, he sentenced Jesus to death by crucifixion, death upon that cross. And now we're going to read the suffering of Jesus from that moment on, after that pronouncement was made, after Pilate pronounced that Jesus would die. Pilate symbolically washed his hands, though he could not wash the guilt away. He was guilty of sentencing this innocent man to death. Today we're going to see the suffering of Jesus Christ, the suffering that our Messiah would go through on our behalf. Just keep in mind, everything that Jesus is going to go through is the things that you and I really deserve. It is what sin deserves. It is what the punishment of sin requires. It requires a death. It requires a sacrificial death. And you can see with what Jesus is going to go through how bad our sin actually is. Let's read the story in the account, just these first 9 verses. Again, we'll pick up the rest of it tomorrow. Then he, that is Pilate, released Barabbas to the people, to the crowd. He listened to the crowd, he released him to the crowd, and when he scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Really just very simple words, just a sentence that is spoken about what is going to go on with Jesus. It says, when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Just that little statement, when he had scourged Jesus. There is so much in those 5 words that is not spoken of, because in that day, the people knew exactly what was being talked about. They knew what scourging was. They knew what the experience of being scourged was. We don't understand it because we're not part of that culture. We weren't a part of that scene and that story. But for the writers in that day to communicate those words, just those 5 words, when he had scourged Jesus, to the people of that day, they understood exactly what had happened. They had witnessed it. They had seen it. Some had family members who had gone through it. They all knew what scourging was. The scourging was the blows that would come from a whip. A whip would have had many leather strands, and woven in those strands of leather, they would have put sharp pieces of bone often sheep's bone. They would have put metal into it. They would have put metal on the tips and on the ends of the leather pieces. And when they would use that to beat the back of somebody, called scourging, it would so rip them apart that the raw flesh, only even to the point of the bones, would begin to show. And it was not unusual, in fact, it was very common for a criminal to die from a scourging even before they got to the point of crucifixion. Dr. William Edwards wrote an article called on the Physical Death of Jesus Christ, and it was published in the Journal of American Medical Association back on March 21st of 1986. And he wrote this article on what Jesus would have gone through at the time when Jesus was crucified. And here's what he says. He says, scourging was a legal preliminary to every Roman execution, and only women and Roman senators or soldiers, except in cases of desertion, were exempt from the scourging. In other words, everybody that had to go to the cross, or everybody that was to be executed first, had to be scourged. The goal of the scourging was to weaken the victim to the state just short of collapse and death. And so they would beat them and they would scourge them with this whip interwoven with bone and metal to bring the criminal who they had in their mind, the person who deserved to die, they wanted to bring them as close to the point of death without killing them. They wanted to make them suffer the most painful way that they possibly could. In that article, Dr. Edwards says these words. He says, as the Roman soldiers repeatedly struck the victim's back with full force, the iron balls would cause deep contusions, and the leather thongs and the sheep bones would cut into the skin and the subcutaneous tissues. Then, as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. Pain and blood loss generally set the stage for circulatory shock. The extent of blood loss may well have determined how long the victim would survive the cross. And so they would beat them to the point of death, but not yet kill them. And then they would hang them on the cross, and they would lose so much blood during the scourging that they were going to be barely able to survive the cross. He goes on to write in the article these words: the severe scourging, with its intense pain and appreciable blood loss, most probably left Jesus in a pre-shock state. Moreover, the skin that had been exposed would be particularly tender. The physical and mental abuse meted out by the Jews and the Romans, as well as the lack of food and water and sleep, also contributed to his generally weakened state. Therefore, even before the actual crucifixion, Jesus' physical condition was at least serious and possibly critical. That's what happened in the scourging. The scourging would have been so painful, so damaging to his body. It would have so ripped open his flesh and exposed his muscles, exposed his bones, his skeletal system, that I don't know how physically a person could actually go through it. It's mind-boggling. And to picture those events in your mind, to picture what actually Jesus would go through on our behalf, is actually something that should move you to tears, to brokenness, to sorrow, to know exactly what Jesus would suffer and what he would go through. Commonly, the blows of scourging would lessen as criminals confess to their crimes. But Jesus remained silent, having no crimes to confess, so the blows would have continued with full strength. It fulfills a prophecy. It fulfills Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5, which says, but he was wounded for our transgression. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and brought by his stripes, in other words, by the stripes produced by the scourging, by the stripes produced by the crucifixion, we as people are actually healed. By him, we are healed. He took upon himself all of the punishment that we ourselves deserved. Let's go on with what it says in the rest of the story. Then the soldiers of the governor, the soldiers of Pilate, took Jesus into the praetorium, and they gathered the whole garrison around him. And they stripped him, and they put a scarlet robe on him, and they twisted a crown of thorns. They put it on his head, a reed in his right hand. They bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they spat on him. They took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they took the robe off him, and put his own clothes on him. And they led him away to be crucified. Now, they brought Jesus into this praetorium. The whole garrison was gathered around him. A garrison could be as many as 600 men, perhaps. It could have been a little bit less than that, but a large group of Roman soldiers would have gathered around him. And you know how any crowd can be. They just feed upon one another's energy. So as one mocks, they all begin to mock. As one beats, they all begin to beat, and it just escalates the whole event. They mocked him. They said, "Hail, King of the Jews." And everything about this entire scene was intended to humiliate Jesus. It was intended to poke fun at and humiliate this man who thought he was the King of the Jews. So what did they do? Well, it says that they stripped him. When a prisoner was crucified, it was often very common that they would be nailed to the cross naked. It was meant to increase their humiliation. Now, Jesus hadn't been crucified yet, but his humiliation had begun, and they just publicly stripped him. They put a scarlet robe on him. Now, scarlet was a royal color. It was an expensive color. The dyes and the fabrics that were used to make this robe were very expensive. Kings would often wear scarlet. So they took a scarlet robe, put it on Jesus as a mocking, a cruel irony to who Jesus thought he was and who Jesus claimed to be. That he is not a king in their eyes, though he is a king in our eyes. They twisted a crown of thorns. Now, you know that kings would often wear crowns, but this was not a normal crown. This was a crown of torture. The specific thorn bushes of that region had thorns that were long, they were hard, they were sharp, maybe 2, 3 inches, 4 inches long. They had woven this crown, and then they put it on his head, and he would have been beaten and bloodied through all of this. They would have taken that reed. A reed was a picture of a scepter. A king would usually hold a scepter, but often it was an ornate scepter that symbolized power. It symbolized authority. The one that Jesus had symbolized a mocking of Jesus. And then they took that reed and they beat the crown into his head, and it would have just caused blood to gush out of his scalp. The pain of those thorns being dug into a person's scalp, I can't even imagine. The Bible tells us that his form was so marred that he could not even be recognized. So picture it, he went through the scourging where his back was just ripped up. His head was being beaten because and bloodied because of the crown. He was being punched. He was being ridiculed. He was stripped naked. They bowed the knee before him. Now, kings are often honored. The people would bow the knee before their king, but they did it in mocking of who Jesus is. Do you know that one day every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord? And they said, "Hail, King of the Jews." They did make a confession, though they said it in mocking. Kings are often greeted with royal titles, but in their spite, in their mockery, they gave Jesus this title. Again, it was all meant to humiliate Jesus. He had been scourged, he had been beaten, he was bloodied. You could not recognize his appearance because he was so beaten and so swollen. He was mocked and ridiculed. One day, Jesus will return, and everybody will realize how wrong they were. They will realize the mistakes that they have made. And then they spat on him. They spat on him. They took the reed. They struck him. Just the spitting into the face of Jesus meant to create humiliation. At that point, it says they took off the robe. They put his own clothes on him, and they led him away to be crucified. Now, as they came out, they found a man, and they were on their way to Golgotha. in order to crucify him. Golgotha means the skull. In Latin, the word is Calvary. It was a place where they were going to crucify. It's a place where they crucified criminals. They led Jesus away to be crucified. Now, the march of leading somebody away to be crucified was often a way of advertising for Rome. It was a way to warn potential troublemakers of their fate should they challenge Rome. Normally, it was a centurion on horseback that would lead the procession, and a herald would shout the crime of the condemned. The criminal was led to the scene of crucifixion by as long of a route as possible, so again, it would create more and more advertising. As Jesus was led away to be crucified, he, like most of the victims of crucifixion, would be forced to carry the wood that he would hang upon. The weight of the entire cross was typically around 300 pounds, but the victim only carried the crossbar, which weighed anywhere from 75 to 125 pounds. Usually when the victim was led away to be crucified carrying that crossbar, they were also stripped down naked, again, so that they could be publicly humiliated, mocked and shamed, and spit upon as they would walk to the cross. When Jesus said, "If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me," this is the scene that Jesus had in mind. Now, as they came out, and as Jesus was being led away, they found a man of Cyrene. His name was Simon. And they compelled him to bear Jesus' cross because Jesus was too weak to be able to bear it. When they had come to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, place of a skull, they gave Jesus sour wine mixed with gall to drink. But when he tasted it, he would not drink. This man who was implored and impressed into bearing the cross of Jesus was probably just a faithful Jew who was in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. He probably came out of the street, wanted to know what was going on. He was from Cyrene, which is in North Africa. It was probably some 800 miles away. He had come a long way to be a part of the Passover, and they compelled him into bearing the cross of Jesus. Simon probably did not know Jesus. He didn't know anything about Jesus. He hadn't heard anything about Jesus, but he was pressed into work to carry the cross for Jesus. In fact, there are many traditions and evidences that point that the sons of Simon of Cyrene actually became leaders among the early Christians. If you look at Mark chapter 15, Romans chapter 16, it really indicates that. They led Jesus to a place called Golgotha, that is, place of the skull. It was a specific place outside of the city walls of Jerusalem. It was still very close to Jerusalem, but it was just outside the city walls where the people were crucified. At this place called the place of the skull, it was there that he would die for us. He would die for our sins, that salvation would be accomplished at Golgotha, at Calvary in the Latin. It was called this place because that's the place where criminals were often crucified. It was a place of cruel, humiliating death. It was outside of the city walls, but it was likely on a very well-established road. It was on the hill that had a skull-like appearance, and that's why it was called Calvary, or it was called Golgotha. It was very common for Jews to crucify people on this place, on this public road, because it was a place everybody would pass by and a place that everybody would see. It was the equivalent then, as it would be the equivalent today, of a person being crucified maybe between a McDonald's and a Starbucks. It was a place where everybody drove by, everybody walked by, everybody passed by. They would often crucify them right next to the road. They would hang them on the cross. They would be very close to the ground, right next to the road. People would mock them, spit upon them, make fun of them as they would walk by. And so the Romans would scourge them, beat them, humiliate them, and then hang them on the cross and let them be mocked as they hung on the cross. Incredible what they would go through. Incredible what Jesus went through. Now, it says that they gave him sour wine to drink, and they mixed it with gall, and when he tasted it, he would not drink it. It was very, very customary to give those who are about to be crucified a pain-numbing, a mind-numbing drink to lessen the awareness of the agony awaiting them. But Jesus refused any numbing drug. He chose to face the spiritual and physical terror with his senses awake. The wine would be used, the sour wine would be used, but Jesus declined to drink it after tasting it, deciding instead that he wanted to suffer with a clear mind. And then it says one final word. It says in the Gospel of Matthew, then they crucified him. In Mark it says, and when they crucified him. In Luke it says, there they crucified him. And in John it says, where they crucified him. Little statements, 4 words, 5 words in Mark. And that's all that is said about the crucifixion. Again, why doesn't it go into more detail? Why only 5 words when it talks about the scourging? Why only 4 words when it talks about the crucifixion? And the reason behind that is because in that day, everybody knew what this was. Everybody knew the pain. Everybody knew the circumstances. Everybody knew what a crucifixion victim went through. Everybody knew people or had family members or friends that had experienced crucifixion. And people knew exactly what it was like. And that's why they only had to give 4 simple words. Then they crucified him. And everybody would have known what that was like. In our day, we don't understand it because we can't identify with it because we don't have that happen today. But then, when they said, then they crucified him, they knew exactly what it was. In the article that I had referenced earlier from the 1986 article by Dr. William Edwards that he wrote in the Journal of American Medical Association, he wrote this article again called On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ. He gave several observations and several statements about what it would have been like for Jesus in that cross, on the cross, and everything that Jesus went through. And I want to read to you some of those statements. So just listen to what it says about crucifixion. Here's what Dr. Edwards wrote. He said this: although the Romans did not invent crucifixion, they perfected it as a form of torture and capital punishment that was designed to produce a slow death with maximum pain and suffering. The death of crucifixion was invented earlier, but it was perfected by the Romans. The Romans found this idea, they liked it and they latched onto it, and they perfected it to the point that they produced maximum pain and suffering. The Romans' goal was to produce as long and drawn out of a death as they possibly could with the maximum amount of pain and suffering. Here's what Dr. Edwards goes on to say. The victim's back was first torn open by the scourging, then open again as the congealing, clotting blood came off with the clothing that was removed at the place of crucifixion. When thrown on the ground to nail the hands to the crossbeam, the wounds were opened again, deepened, and contaminated with dirt. While attached to the upright cross, each breath would cause the painful wounds on the back to scrape against the rough wood of the upright beam and were further aggravated. Driving the nail through the wrist severed the large median nerve. This stimulated nerve caused bolts of fiery pain in both arms and often resulted in a claw-like grip in the victim's hands. Beyond the severe pain, the major effect of crucifixion inhibited normal breathing. The weight of the body pulling down on the arms and shoulders tended to lock the respiratory muscles in an inhalation state, thus hindering exhalation. The lack of adequate respiration resulted in severe muscle cramps, which hindered breathing even further. To get a good breath, one had to push against the feet and flex the elbows, pulling up from the shoulders. Putting the weight of the body on the feet produced more pain, and flexing the elbows twisted the hands hanging on the nails. Lifting the body for each breath also painfully scraped the back against the rough wooden post. Each effort to get a proper breath was agonizing, exhausting, and led to a sooner death. Not uncommonly, insects would light upon or burrow into the open wounds on the eyes, ears, and nose of the dying and helpless victim, and birds of prey would tear at these sights. Moreover, it was customary to leave the corpse on the cross to be devoured by predatory animals. Death from crucifixion would come from many sources. Could come from acute shock from blood loss, being too exhausted to breathe any longer, dehydration, stress-induced heart attack, or congestive heart failure leading to a cardiac rupture. If the victim did not die quickly enough, the legs were broken and the victim was soon unable to breathe. A Roman citizen could not be crucified except by order of Caesar. It was reserved for the worst criminals and lowest classes. No wonder that the Roman statesman Cicero said of crucifixion, "It is a crime to bind a Roman citizen. To scourge him is an act of wickedness. To execute him is almost murder. What shall I say of crucifying him? An act so abominable, it is impossible to find any word adequately to express." The Roman historian Tacitus called crucifixion a torture fit only for slaves, fit only for them because they were seen as subhuman. How bad was crucifixion? We get our English word excruciating from the Roman word out of the cross. Consider how heinous sin must be in the sight of God when it requires such a sacrifice. Jesus went through the most excruciating form of pain, the most excruciating type of suffering, the most excruciating execution ever devised by mankind, because sin was that bad. He went through all of this on our behalf. He went through all of this to take upon himself what each one of us deserves. Then they crucified him. It's significant to remember that Jesus did not suffer as the victim of circumstances. He was in complete control. Jesus said of his life in John chapter 10, verse 18, "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself." Jesus endured that kind of torture, that kind of pain of his own choosing, because he loves us. He cares for us. Can you ever rightly doubt God's love for you when you understand exactly what Jesus went through on your behalf? He went through the most extreme length to demonstrate the extreme love that he has for you and for me. I hope that you have received and trusted in that love that he offers to each one of us. If you haven't, make today the day that you choose to do so. Tomorrow we'll conclude the crucifixion of Jesus. Join me back here then. We'll see you at that point. God bless you.